Imagine, just for a second, that you're standing in your own backyard.
Okay.
It's a Saturday morning, and you're looking down at this small green plant with little white flowers.
Right.
And it's just popping up right in the middle of your perfectly manicured grass.
The classic suburban nightmare.
Exactly. So a few days later, you check your mail, and there's a letter from your homeowners association. They are slapping you with a heavy fine for letting that specific plant grow.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So you pay the fine, you grumble about the neighborhood rules, and then you head down to the hardware store to buy some chemical spray to just kill it.
Like everyone does.
Yeah. But what if the very plant you just paid a premium to eradicate could literally help you survive a famine?
Wait, a famine?
Seriously. And what if that exact same little white flower has been, like, scientifically proven to treat severe illnesses? And, it also serves as one of the single most important food sources, keeping our honeybees alive.
I mean, it genuinely sounds like the premise of a dystopian novel. The idea that you would be legally penalized by your neighbors for growing a free, life-saving survival tool right on your own property.
Yeah.
But it is not fiction at all. It's the reality for millions of people living in American suburbs right now.
Okay, let's unpack this, because today's deep dive is based on a truly mind-bending article from Right.S. It's titled White Clover, the plant that was criminalized for profit.
It's such a good piece.
It really is.
Yeah.
The author lays out this wild 70-year history of how a literal superfood was systematically transformed into a villain in the public consciousness.
Yeah, and to really understand the sheer scale of what happened here, we have to connect some seemingly unrelated dots.
Okay.
We're going to explore basic plant biology, the development of World War II biological weapons.
Which is just crazy.
No, it gets crazier. We'll look at mid-century corporate marketing and how the entire modern aesthetic of the perfect lawn was completely manufactured by chemical companies simply to secure peacetime profits.
So the plant at the center of all this drama is white clover. Scientifically, it's known as Trifolium repens.
Right.
But before we dive into the whole criminalization aspect, I really want to understand its historical context. Because for centuries, this little plant was basically an insurance policy against starvation. Right?
Absolutely. Historically, when grain crops failed across Europe and widespread famine started sweeping the countryside, populations survived specifically by foraging white clover.
Really?
Yeah. It is incredibly resilient. I mean, it grows almost everywhere, requires absolutely zero cultivation, and it produces edible leaves, flowers, and seeds for months, like from early spring all the way through late fall.
The source actually mentions people cooking the leaves like spinach.
Mm-hmm.
But the really fascinating part to me was what they did when things got genuinely desperate.
Yes, the flour.
Yeah.
When traditional grains like wheat or rye were unavailable, people would harvest the dried clover flowers and the seed pods, and they'd grind them down.
Just right into flour.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It created a highly nutritious flour. You could mix it with whatever scarce grain you had left, or just bake with it entirely on its own. And, it was naturally gluten-free, but more importantly, for a starving population, it was incredibly high in protein.
And it wasn't just a European survival tactic either. The article notes that long before European settlers even arrived in North America, indigenous tribes had already integrated white clover into their daily lives.
Very deeply, yeah.
Particularly in their medical practices.
They utilized it extensively. The Cherokee, for instance, brewed a specific tea from white clover to treat severe fevers.
Wow.
And the Iroquois utilized the plant to alleviate respiratory issues, particularly coughs and colds. I mean, for 2 millennia, human beings across different continents looked at this plant as a free pharmacy and grocery store.
And it required absolutely no money and no permission to grow.
Right.
Now, I always approach ancient herbal remedies with a bit of skepticism.
Sure, that's fair.
But the source details some staggering modern medical research that backs this all up. There was a study in 2018 regarding blood sugar, and I want to make sure I understand the mechanics of it.
Oh, the 2018 study is remarkable. So, researchers were looking at an enzyme in the human body called alpha amylase.
Okay.
To give you some context, alpha amylase is responsible for breaking down complex carbohydrates into simple sugars.
So when you eat a heavy meal.
Exactly. When you eat a carb-heavy meal, this enzyme is what causes your blood sugar to suddenly spike.
I see.
So if you can inhibit that enzyme, you can slow down the digestion of carbs and control the blood sugar spike.
And that is what modern diabetes drugs do, correct?
Precisely. The standard pharmaceutical drug for this is called acarbose.
Okay.
So the researchers ran laboratory tests to see how an extract made from just white clover stacked up against a carbose in inhibiting this enzyme.
And they measured this using something called an IC50 value.
Yes.
An IC50 value.
Let's break that term down for a second for people who aren't, scientists. What does IC50 actually measure in a lab setting?
It stands for half maximal inhibitory concentration.
Essentially, it is a measurement of how much of a specific substance is required to inhibit a biological process by 50%.
So in this context, a lower number is significantly better.
Exactly. Because it means you need a much smaller dose of the substance to achieve the desired effect.
Got it. So how did the clover extract compare to the actual pharmaceutical drug?
The acarbose required an IC50 concentration of 50 micrograms per milliliter to inhibit the enzyme.
Okay, 50.
The white clover extract achieved the exact same level of inhibition at just 25 micrograms per milliliter.
Wait, really? So it was twice as potent?
Twice as potent.
It took half the dose of the clover extract to do the exact same job as the leading pharmaceutical.
It controlled the process better than the engineered drug.
Yeah.
And the medical applications explored in the research don't even stop at blood sugar.
There's more.
Yeah, a separate study published in 2015 looked at human leukemia cells in vitro.
Wow.
When they introduced white clover extracts, it didn't just slow the growth of those cancer cells, it halted the growth entirely.
That is unbelievable.
And then combine that with its nutritional profile. The fresh leaves pack more protein than spinach, and they are just loaded with vitamins A, B, C, and E. Plus, vital minerals like magnesium, potassium, and calcium.
So the entire plant is just a complete powerful protein source.
Exactly.
Look, I completely understand that it has a fantastic nutritional profile and these incredible medicinal properties,
Right.
but I have to challenge the premise here a bit. Society doesn't just collectively wake up one morning and decide to abandon a superfood.
That's a good point.
I mean, even if it kept our ancestors alive, we aren't foragers anymore. Isn't it possible that as we moved into modern suburbs, people just genuinely preferred the look of a clean, uniform grass lawn?
You'd think so, but
Because having a uniform lawn just seems easier to manage. And if I want spinach or vitamins, I just go to the grocery store now. Did we really need a sinister corporate push to ditch a wild yard plant?
what's fascinating here is we didn't naturally evolve out of this preference. The desire for that sterile, uniform lawn was intentionally programmed into the public.
Programmed.
Yes. Homeowners weren't complaining about clover. To understand how that shift actually occurred, we have to move our timeline back to the year 1945.
Okay, 1945.
And we have to look at how a failed wartime weapon was repurposed into a domestic consumer product.
The biological weapon angle.
Yeah.
The article mentions a chemical compound called 2,4-D, which was synthesized in 1941.
Right.
How does a military weapon make the leap to suburban lawn care?
So during World War II, the Allied forces were developing a strategy for agricultural warfare.
Okay.
The original intent for 2004D was to load this newly synthesized chemical into airplanes and aerially spray it over Germany and Japan.
Just carpet bomb the crops.
Exactly. The goal was to systematically destroy their vital potato and rice fields, essentially starving the enemy populations into surrender by collapsing their food supply.
But the timeline didn't work out right.
Yeah.
The war ended before they could actually deploy the chemical.
Yeah, Germany fell, Japan surrendered, and the chemical manufacturers who had been contracted by the government suddenly found themselves sitting on these massive, overflowing warehouses full of this highly effective herbicide.
Oh, man.
They had no war left to fight, but, they were a business. They still needed to generate a profit in peacetime.
Right, they have all this product.
Exactly. So, just 6 months after the end of World War II, a company called the American Chemical Paint Company took that exact same wartime formula, rebranded it for the domestic market, and launched it as Weed One.
Weed One.
Yes. It became the world's first widely available consumer herbicide.
But wait, if they are spraying this on lawns, why doesn't it just kill the grass along with the weeds? The source calls it a selective herbicide.
Right.
How does a chemical liquid actually know the difference between a blade of grass and a white clover plant?
Well, the chemical doesn't know anything. It simply exploits the anatomical differences between plant types.
Oh.
2004D is fundamentally a synthetic plant hormone, specifically an auxin. In nature, auxins regulate plant growth.
Okay, so it helps them grow.
Normally, yes. But 2004D delivers a massive lethal overdose of this hormone.
So it forces the plant to just grow itself to death.
Exactly. But here is the mechanism that makes it selective. Broadleaf plants, like white clover, dandelions, and most of the crops the military wanted to target.
Right.
They have wide surface areas and very complex networked vascular systems. They absorb a massive amount of this synthetic hormone very quickly.
I see.
Their cells rapidly and uncontrollably divide until the plant's vascular tissue literally collapses under the chaotic growth.
Oh, wow.
But grasses belong to a different family called monocots. They have narrow vertical leaves and a parallel vein structure. They simply don't absorb or process the chemical the same way.
That makes sense.
So the broadleaf plants mutate and die, while the grass survives almost entirely unaffected.
Okay, let me make sure I'm visualizing this correctly. It's less like a smart bomb that specifically targets an enemy and more like setting off an electromagnetic pulse.
Oh, I like that.
Right. Like if your grass is a mechanical wooden clock, the pulse just washes over it and the clock keeps ticking. But the clover is a digital watch. The pulse hits it, overloads the circuits, and completely fries the system.
That is a perfect analogy. Because white clover is a broadleaf plant growing right there in the grass, it became the inevitable structural casualty of this new chemical technology.
It never stood a chance.
Not at all. If you sprayed 2004D to kill unwanted weeds, your yard's clover was mathematically guaranteed to die alongside them.
Which brings up a massive business conflict.
Huge.
Because if this American chemical paint company launches Weed 1, what does that mean for the companies already dominating the lawn care space? The source heavily focuses on the O.M. Scott & Sons company.
Right. Most people today know them simply as Scotts. They had been selling lawn seed in America since 1868.
A long time.
Yeah, and for nearly 80 years, every single bag of premium lawn seed they sold intentionally contained white clover.
Wait, on purpose?
It wasn't an accident at all. Homeowners expected it to be in the mix. Expert gardening guides at the time explicitly recommended it.
Wow.
Clover was universally considered an essential foundational component of a healthy premium lawn.
So the 1950s roll around, and Scott sees this lucrative new chemical market exploding. They decide to launch their own herbicide containing 2004D.
Yep.
But now they have an obvious contradiction on their hands. They are selling bags of seed intentionally packed with clover, and on the very next shelf, they're aggressively marketing a poison that explicitly kills clover.
It's quite the paradox. One of those products had to be eliminated from their catalog. And this is where the corporate logic dictates culture.
Because of the money.
Always the money. The profit margins on these newly developed synthetic herbicides were significantly higher than the margins on traditional grass and clover seeds. The choice was purely economic.
So they just cut it.
By the 1950s, Scotts completely dropped white clover from all of their residential seed mixes. And again, they didn't do this because the plant stopped working or because of a sudden wave of consumer complaints.
Right.
It vanished solely because it interfered with their new, more profitable chemical sales.
But simply removing it from the seed bag doesn't stop it from growing naturally in people's yards. I mean, to sell the herbicide, they had to convince people to actively hate a plant they had been enthusiastically buying just a few years prior.
That is where the great rebranding campaign begins. Scotts and other chemical companies launched a brilliant and frankly insidious marketing strategy.
What do they do?
They began widely publishing before and after photos in magazines and newspapers. They started depicting pure, uniform grass monocultures, a sterile, glossy green carpet as the brand new definition of suburban beauty.
And the clover.
They aggressively rebranded it as an ugly weed. They trained homeowners to view those little white flowers in their grass not as a sign of biodiversity, but as a shameful sign of neglect.
They preyed on the desire to keep up with the Joneses.
Exactly.
But the biological function of the plant hadn't changed one bit. And the true brilliance, or maybe the true cynicism, of this marketing strategy becomes incredibly clear when you look at the underlying economics of how a lawn actually survives.
Yes, the soil biology.
Right, let's talk about the nitrogen cycle, because grass needs nitrogen to stay green.
It is the absolute lifeblood of a grass lawn. Without a steady supply of nitrogen, the grass simply turns yellow, stops growing, and eventually dies.
Okay.
Now, white clover happens to be a legume. Like beans or peas, legumes possess an incredible evolutionary trait. They form a symbiotic relationship with specific microscopic bacteria in the soil, known as rhizobia.
How does that relationship work?
These bacteria actually infect the roots of the clover, forming little nodules. In exchange for the clover providing the bacteria with carbohydrates, the bacteria do something incredible.
What's that?
They literally pull inert nitrogen gas right out of the atmosphere, process it, and convert it into a usable natural fertilizer directly in the soil.
No way.
It is an on-demand fertilizer factory. A healthy patch of white clover interwoven with your grass can independently produce up to 150 pounds of nitrogen per acre every single year.
The source breaks down the modern math on this, and it is staggering.
It really is.
Currently, synthetic nitrogen fertilizer costs about 60 cents per pound.
Mm.
So if you have clover integrated into your lawn, that plant is generating about $90 per acre in free natural fertilizer year after year, forever.
But fertilizer companies do not make money on atmospheric gas.
Right.
They sell synthetic nitrogen in plastic bags. So every single characteristic that made clover incredibly valuable to the homeowner, the fact that it fed the soil for free, that its deep root system kept the yard green through harsh summer droughts, that it required significantly less watering.
All the good stuff.
Exactly. All that made it completely unprofitable for the chemical companies.
Let me make sure I'm mapping this out correctly. By aggressively marketing a poison to kill the clover, these companies deliberately starved the grass of its natural free food source. And they do this just so they could turn around and sell those exact same homeowners the synthetic nitrogen needed to fix the problem they just artificially created.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, that is the ultimate cyclical profit model. They successfully changed the very definition of natural beauty to mandate total chemical dependency.
That's wild.
They convinced millions of consumers that the only acceptable yard was a sterile, biologically broken environment that could not sustain itself.
Right.
It structurally requires the homeowner to continuously purchase synthetic inputs, fertilizers, herbicides, pesticides, just to keep it on life support.
And that advertising campaign was so systematic, so deeply embedded in suburban culture, that by the 1960s, you had a whole new generation of homeowners moving into these booming post-war neighborhoods who had never even seen clover included in a lawn seed mix.
Right. They had no idea.
They had just absorbed decades of messaging telling them it was an invader. So they went to the hardware store and bought the weed killer every spring without asking a single question.
Which leads directly to the devastating large-scale consequences we are living with today. This wasn't just a clever corporate trick to sell a few extra bags of fertilizer.
No.
It completely altered the broader ecology of our living spaces. Before the 1950s, American suburban lawns essentially functioned as a massive, distributed pollinator habitat.
Because of all the clover.
Yes, you had millions of small, flowering patches physically connected across thousands of neighborhoods.
But when everyone started systematically spraying 2004D to achieve that sterile green carpet, those flowers vanished overnight.
Gone.
And the cost to the natural world has been astronomical. The article highlights some chilling statistics regarding honeybees.
It's heartbreaking.
Yeah. In the 1940s, right before this marketing shift, there were 5 million managed honeybee colonies in the United States. By 2023, that number had dropped to just over 2.5 million. That is a 46% collapse in the population.
And the loss of clover nectar, completely eliminated by these selective herbicides, is a direct driving cause of that collapse.
Why is clover specifically so important to them compared to, other flowers?
It comes down to timing and availability. Bees rely heavily on white clover flowers because they bloom very early in the spring and persist late into the fall.
Oh, so it's the edges of the season.
Exactly. These are the crucial buffer periods when very few other natural food sources are available for the hives. When you spray the clover in your yard, you essentially cut off the bees' primary food supply during their most vulnerable months.
It's terrible.
We transformed our residential spaces into sprawling food deserts for the very insects that sustain our broader agricultural system.
And while nature is paying that price, the financial cost to society is just as massive. Today, the United States lawn care market generates $120 billion annually.
Unbelievable.
A massive, disproportionate chunk of that revenue is just synthetic fertilizers because, as we established, these grass monocultures require constant artificial life support to survive.
It is an engineered system that produces nothing but recurring expense. And perhaps the most frustrating aspect is that participating in this system is no longer a voluntary choice for most people.
This is the craziest part to me.
Right. 70% of new American suburban developments are strictly governed by homeowner association covenants.
HOAs.
Yes, many of these HOAs explicitly ban clover and mandate uniform grass. They have literally codified a 1950s marketing campaign into binding legal contracts.
It's wild. I mean, think about your own neighborhood for a second. If you live in one of these planned areas, you are legally bound by an HOA to participate in a $120 billion subscription service for vanity.
That's a great way to put it.
You are paying a premium just to keep your yard sterile and hungry.
This raises an important question. Why do we as a society still adhere to these rules without pushback? The justification used by HOAs and city ordinances is always aesthetic uniformity or protecting property values. But the practical effect on the ground is the aggressive criminalization of self-sufficiency. You have neighbors who will literally report you to an authority figure for letting a highly nutritious flower bloom on the property you own.
Which brings us to the absolute ultimate irony of this entire saga. The cherry on top is what the Scott's company is doing right now.
Oh yes, the 2024 strategic pivot.
Yeah. According to the source, in 2024, the Scott's company, the exact same corporate entity that spent 70 years and millions of advertising dollars convincing your grandparents and parents to aggressively kill clover, is now selling clover seed again.
It's almost funny.
They are heavily marketing it to a new generation as a sustainable lawn alternative because, as they now openly admit, along with just 20% clover requires zero synthetic nitrogen fertilizer and uses 30% less water.
But the article astutely points out the lingering reality. Scott's still sells exponentially more herbicide than they do clover seed.
Of course they do.
They can introduce a sustainable product, but the cultural programming is just too deeply entrenched to simply reverse. The programming works beautifully.
People still hate it.
Most people still intrinsically believe clover is a nuisance. Professional lawn care companies still automatically spray for it, and HOAs will still gladly fine you for it. The system now perpetuates itself because each generation passes down the manufactured aesthetic to the next, completely unaware of its origins.
So what does this all mean? Let's take a step back and recap this wild journey. We have a remarkably resilient plant that literally sustained human populations through centuries of brutal famine.
Yep.
It possesses staggering, scientifically validated medicinal properties that can naturally inhibit blood sugar spikes better than standard pharmaceuticals and halt the aggressive growth of human leukemia cells.
That's incredible.
It pulls free fertilizer from the sky and feeds our collapsing bee populations. But it was systematically eradicated from American life simply because a chemical weapons manufacturer needed to find a way to sell leftover 2004D after World War II.
Such a strange twist of fate.
Right. They manipulated the seed companies, and together they tricked 3 generations of people into viewing a life-saving survival food as a shameful, ugly weed.
It serves as the ultimate test case for manufactured preference. If a cultural norm or aesthetic standard only emerges after a company begins advertising it, and that new norm strictly benefits the financial bottom line of the company selling the products, the norm was created, not discovered.
Oh, that's a great point.
Americans did not spontaneously decide that white clover was ugly in 1950. They were taught it was ugly by the specific people profiting immensely from its destruction.
So the next time you are walking to your car or standing in your backyard on a Saturday morning and you see a patch of white clover popping up in the grass, don't look at it and see a weed. Look at it for what it truly is.
A survivor.
Yeah, you are looking at a microscopic factory pulling free nitrogen fertilizer from the atmosphere. You are looking at vital, essential habitat, keeping our honeybees alive. You are looking at superior blood sugar medicine. But most importantly, you are looking at an incredibly resilient survivor of a 70-year chemical warfare campaign.
It's a remarkably powerful shift in perspective. Once you truly understand the history and the biology, you just can't unsee the manipulation.
And that leaves us with a final thought to mull over, something that stretches far beyond just suburban lawn care. We just learned that the very definition of natural beauty in our own backyards was entirely artificially manufactured by a chemical company in the 1950s simply to protect their bottom line.
Makes you wonder.
It really forces you to wonder what other fundamental norms in our daily lives are actually just the lingering ghosts of a forgotten corporate marketing strategy. Think about the design and layout of our homes, the way our cities are zoned, or the highly processed foods we consider acceptable to feed our kids. What else in your life has been artificially criminalized or deemed socially unacceptable, just so someone could sell you the cure? So when you think back to that imaginary HOA fine from your neighbors, remember you aren't actually being penalized for having a messy yard. You're being penalized for growing a survival tool. Keep questioning the programming.